Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Victims of Human Trafficking. This is the third webinar in the Engaging Subpopulations of Clients Experiencing Homelessness with SMI or CODs series. My name is Zach Stewart, and I'm going to be running things behind the scenes today. So I'm just going to kick us off with a couple of quick housekeeping slides before we get started. I want to let you know that this event is being recorded, and everyone should be hearing my voice now. We are providing audio via the computer speakers and by phone, but we strongly encourage you to use the computer audio if possible. So please choose just one audio source. If you're hearing my voice through both the phone and the computer, please hang up the phone. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services or the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We are providing live captioning for this webinar today. You can click the link on your screen to access those live captions, and we've also provided that link at the top of the All Questions box located right underneath the slides. Captions will open in a new window or tab that you can position anywhere you like on your screen, and you can adjust the size, color, and speed of those captions. Your line is going to be muted for today's presentation, but we do have a couple ways where you can communicate with us. That first is going to be in that public chat box right underneath my picture there to the right of the slides. I see many of you have found that already. I want to let you know that anything you type in that box is visible to everybody in the room. And comments in that chat box do not reflect the views or policies of the presenters, CMHS, CSAT, SAMHSA, or HHS. And then we also have that All Questions box that I mentioned, which is going to be located right beneath the slides. We do ask that you type all your questions in there, both tech and content. We will answer your tech questions right in that box, and then we will save your content questions for the Q&A session at the end of today's event. We also have a couple status icons. If you need any assistance today, you can use those as well. It looks like a person raising their hand. You can click on that to raise your hand, and then you have a couple other options in that box as well. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our moderator today, Sherry Downing, Deputy Director of the Homeless and Housing Resource Network. Sherry, you can take it away.
Thanks, Zach. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to have you here today and to share the information that we'll be sharing. This is a topic that we really haven't gotten to cover before, so we've pulled in some really excellent speakers to tell you about the work that they do around human trafficking. So welcome. Before we get started, I would like to introduce Doreen Gross, who is the PATH Program Coordinator in SAMHSA's Division of State and Community Systems Development. Ms. Gross has more than 20 years of experience working with grants and contracts portfolios associated with people who are at risk for or experiencing homelessness. And that includes PATH, the treatment for individuals experiencing homelessness, cooperative agreements to benefit homeless individuals, and services and supportive housing grant programs. Ms. Gross has worked with other federal partners, including the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Administration for Children, Youth, and Families, and many others to coordinate services, policies, and housing and homeless-related activities. She served as a contracting officer representative or CORE on the Homeless and Housing Resource Network technical assistance contract that is supporting this webinar. And HHRN provides technical assistance and support to federal, state, and local agencies, as well as providers, individuals, and families who experience or are at risk of homelessness. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland, and we are delighted that she is leading PATH. Over to you, Doreen.
Okay, thank you so much, Sherry. Thank you for the introduction. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. As we gradually get back to our routines and spend more time out in the community, I'd like to take a moment to thank you all for what you do. We are doing more, but we still need to be mindful SAMHSA has set up a webpage that provides information on COVID-19 and how it affects the mental health and substance use treatment community. That page is at samhsa.gov/coronavirus. Today, we are focusing on helping victims of human trafficking. Our presenters will explain the different types of human trafficking, and you'll learn what to look for. Many common assumptions about what human trafficking looks like are wrong because it is such a widespread and hidden problem. Numerous federal agencies are offering assistance to communities, such as the Department of Justice, Department of Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Interior, Labor, just to name a few. They are all focusing on this effort, as well as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Legal Services Corporation, and U.S. Agency for International Development. Today, we'll learn about how to help victims of human trafficking by addressing their trauma, providing mental health and substance use treatment, and linking them to housing. On behalf of all of us at SAMHSA, thank you all for the work you do, and we hope you find today's presentation helpful. I'll turn it back over to Sherry.
Thank you, Doreen. Nice job. All right, moving on, I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers. Karen Romero is the Freedom Network Training Institute Director. The Institute develops and delivers high-quality training, technical assistance to human trafficking programs on serving survivors of trafficking, and that includes access to housing. Karen joined Freedom Network USA with a history in direct service and program management in the areas of human rights, including violence against women and immigrant rights. She received her master's in psychology from the University of Utah, and she's a native Spanish speaker who has worked with the survivors of sexual assault as a bilingual therapist at Utah's Rape Crisis Center. She went on to direct a domestic violence shelter for women and children and later served as the social services director for IUDA, supervising a team of case managers and therapists serving survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking in the DC metro area. Most recently, Karen worked at Polaris on the strategic initiative to address the sex trafficking of women and girls from Latin America. We are also pleased to welcome Jess Torres, who is the Survivor Leadership Program Coordinator at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, or CAST, and co-chair of the National Survivor Network. They are a 2019 Women's Policy Institute Fellow who successfully passed their Human Trafficking Initiative in the state of California. They serve as a keynote speaker, trainer, and presenter for various efforts throughout LA County, and recently was recognized by the City of LA with a Changemaker Award. That's pretty cool. A certificate of recognition from the California Senate in honor of outstanding community service for their work as trainer with the California Department of Social Services. Jess is also an independent consultant, collaborating with various federal agencies and participating in a variety of national conferences and symposiums, including work with Freedom Network, UN Delta 8.7, and the Human Trafficking Institute. So we are thrilled that both of you are here to talk to us today. And with no further ado, I'm going to move on to our agenda. So we've already scratched off welcome and introductions. And then we'll follow that with a little bit of an introduction to human trafficking, then recommendations for service providers working with the victims and including how to recognize symptoms of being trafficked, Q&A, and then closing. At the end of this webinar, what we hope you'll be able to do is distinguish the various categories of human trafficking, recognize potential victims, and be able to state the types of services that survivors need. And now, with no further ado, I will hand it over to you, Karen. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much. I am really excited to be able to
be with everyone today. As it was mentioned, my name is Karen Romero. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Training Institute Director for Freedom Network USA. I'm really excited to be able to spend some time with you all to talk a little bit about human trafficking. And so to give you a little bit of just a quick background on what Freedom Network USA is, we are a national coalition of service providers, survivors, and advocates working to address human trafficking through a rights-based approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And when I talk about the coalition, we are nationwide. And so we have members throughout the U.S. Who are working directly with survivors of trafficking, as well as those with lived experience in order to really further this work. And so when we talk about a rights-based approach, at its core, it's really an understanding that human trafficking is a violation of an individual's human rights and their personal freedom. And it really takes into account the root causes. So that's going to be poverty, gender-based discrimination, racism, and injustice that really fuels human trafficking. Additionally, we do run a training and technical assistance project under the Office for Victims of Crime to address housing for survivors of trafficking. So we work directly with service providers in order to understand different housing resources, models, and opportunities to ensure that survivors are housed safely and appropriately. And so we're happy to answer any questions around that. And so today my intention is to be able to cover some of the fundamentals of human trafficking. You may already be familiar with this topic, so I definitely want you to share your thoughts, share your experiences in the chat box, because I'm always learning as well, and I think it's useful for us to learn as peers. Of course, feel free to ask any questions, and we'll have some time at the end to answer those. So I want to start off with a poll of just getting an understanding of who's in the room today. We want to know how familiar you already are with human trafficking. And so you'll see the poll pop up. It's going to have not familiar at all, you've heard of it, you've attended a training in the past, or you're currently working with survivors. And we'll just give it a couple more seconds, and then we will broadcast and show the results just so we have a sense and we can best tailor our content to meet who's currently joining us. So we'll give it just a couple more seconds, and then we can go ahead and show the results. Okay, great. We're getting a lot of participation. Okay, so you should be seeing we can go ahead and show the results. You should be able to see the results come up on your screen. And so it seems like there's a very good mix. It seems like actually there's no one that identifies that as not being familiar at all with human trafficking. And so for the majority, it seems like you've at least heard of it. There's definitely people who have attended a training in the past. And there are a lot of individuals who are working with survivors currently. So that is great. That's wonderful. The structure that I'm hoping to take today is to kind of do the what, where, why, who, and how of human trafficking. And then Jess is really going to go in depth with the survivor needs. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. And as you all know, or probably have heard, there is a federal definition for the crime of human trafficking within the U.S. that is provided by the TVPA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And basically it breaks it down into 3 categories. And those include, the first one is those who are under 18 years of age, who are minors, and are involved in commercial sex acts. So they're automatically considered a trafficking victim. The second are those who are 18 years or older and are involved in commercial sex acts through force, fraud, or coercion. So you'll see that that's a little bit different, where the force, fraud, and coercion is not needed if you are under 18 years old. And then finally, the third are those who are forced to perform labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion. So I really want to acknowledge and highlight that when we're talking about human trafficking, we're talking both about sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And I'll talk in a moment about what those actually look like. So for human trafficking, really that structure, it can really include different models, if you will. And so although the TVPA is the legal definition of human trafficking in the U.S., really what it boils down to is that human trafficking is the exploitation for purpose of labor and sex. So in the definition, you have at least two actors. You have traffickers, and then you have victims and survivors. I will note that on terminology, we in Freedom Network use the word survivors, or we choose to use the word survivors as a term of empowerment, but we know that there's a lot of providers that may use the word victim, that may use client, participant, whatever you all feel is what, the terminology that you all adapt to, but we use survivors, so just to make that note. So while traffickers and victims are often, they often share many underlying qualities. For example, traffickers and victims have diverse profiles. They can range from, specifically for traffickers, it can be an organized crime ring versus one single individual who's trafficking people. And for victims or survivors, they can be trafficked in groups. It can be one person, they can be U.S. citizens, non-citizens, adult children, etc. And so really the models that we see, or at least the profiles that we see, are maybe different than maybe what is commonly put out there, whether it's through media or through other information that you may get. And so I want to break down a little bit more the forced fraud or coercion. Like I mentioned, human trafficking in its definition, in order to identify someone as a survivor or a victim of trafficking, it does include those three, except in the case of minors who are exploited for sex. And so something that we use commonly in the field is the AMP model, which can help illustrate that legal definition by putting it into buckets. So at a minimum, one element from each column must be met in order for a person to be considered a survivor of trafficking. Again, under federal law, any minor under the age of 18 that is in commercial sex is considered to be a victim of sex trafficking, and there is no need for forced fraud or coercion necessary, because through the definition, a minor cannot consent to commercial sex. Also, when we're referring to commercial sex in value, it doesn't need to mean money, or it can be anything that that person seems as valuable, that minor seems as valuable. So for the action, it refers to the action of the trafficker. What action is the trafficker taking? The means is what the trafficker employs, and the purpose is the end goal. So for example, you may have a young man who was promised a teaching job by a family friend, and once he goes to that state or country for the job, he finds out that he's actually not getting paid, that there was no job, and that he will actually be working in agriculture and in the field. And now that he's not being paid and he doesn't have that job, he is now told that he's in debt and that he must work to pay off his trip as well as the rent that is occurring. So in this example, the action would be to recruit. The means would be fraud, because there wasn't the job that this man was promised, and then the purpose is labor trafficking. Of course, this is one example, but there may be other means such as force. And I'll talk about some of the examples that I saw throughout my working with survivors. So where does trafficking happen? Really, when it comes to trafficking, we often associate it with other countries. However, we know that trafficking happens in every country. It definitely happens in every state within the U.S. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. I want to break it down into labor trafficking and sex trafficking, just to highlight a little information on both. So I think most often, in my experience, the general public and even practitioners within the anti-trafficking field are often most familiar with sex trafficking. However, we know that labor trafficking is very common. So labor trafficking happens when workers are trapped and they feel like they have to keep working for someone even if they don't want to. I know it can be close to labor exploitation, so we try to be very careful with that, and really a legal service provider familiar and that works in the anti-trafficking field would be your best resource in being able to serve that survivor. So they can be working alongside non-trafficked workers in legal jobs and in legal sectors. They may be working under the table for no pay in a legal business, or they may be forced to commit criminal acts that benefit someone else. The trafficker, it can range really from family members, strangers, friends, and they may be trapped either by violence, threats against themselves or their family, manipulation, and other methods. And so what I've seen, and I think this is common with my colleagues, is for a lot of labor trafficking, a lot of traffickers often target immigrants whose legal status, they may not have a legal status, and they also prey on vulnerable U.S. citizens. And so we know that there are a lot of venues and industries in which labor trafficking can happen. I think one way that I have heard it that really resonated is anywhere that you see a worker, labor trafficking can happen there. And so you'll see in this graphic from the Urban Institute that they broke out through the study kind of where they were seeing cases reported, and you can see, it really ranges from anything from domestic servitude to agriculture to factories, etc. For sex trafficking, I think what we have seen the most common is what people would refer to as street prostitution or sex work, online exploitation, massage parlors, apartments, or motels. Because sex work is generally illegal in the U.S., sex trafficking victims are often unwilling or to seek help or sometimes even refuse assistance or protection. So the federal law does distinguish between sex work and sex trafficking, except in cases involving minors or cases that involve force, fraud, or coercion. So really the bottom line and the takeaway here is that not all sex workers are trafficking victims. I feel like that is always conflated or commonly conflated. So it's just really important to acknowledge that sex work does not equal sex trafficking. And then I wanted to share, quickly a kind of a case study of one of the clients that I served while working in direct services. And so during my time as the director of a social service department in a nonprofit, we had gotten a referral for a group of teachers from the Philippines. It was both men and women that had been trafficked and really relocated to the DC metropolitan area from the Philippines. And so initially, when they were in their home country, they were teachers and they were working in that field. They were recruited by a person who was very well known in that community and actually very well respected. And this person, he had, told them that he was able to get them visas, that he had already lined up jobs with various different colleges and schools throughout. It wasn't even the same location where they ended up going. He had promised that they were going to be going to Florida and other states. And once those people decided that they wanted to take that opportunity, he did charge them a fee for recruiting them for their visa application. And also, once they were in the U.S., they started, according to him, accruing different fees such as, rent and being provided food, which it was minimal, and people were sharing a room, literally a room with like 20 other people. So it wasn't that they actually had a safe place to stay. Once they got here, they found out that there was no job, no teaching job. And many of them were actually forced to work in childcare and were not paid for their work. And so it wasn't until they were able to communicate with some people in their own community that we got some referrals through word of mouth, which we found was kind of the more common referral method for us. And once they were able to exit that situation, a lot of them felt like they still had debt. And oftentimes that's really why many of them ended up staying, is because they were told that they had accrued a lot of debt and they had to pay it back. And also because in their home country, that person, the trafficker, they had been doing threats against their family. And so oftentimes with foreign nationals, people who are coming from other countries, that is a common method and tactic that I've seen, is that there are a lot of threats, not just to the individual, but often more to the family, because that can to be more, unfortunately, more effective or keep people in that situation. And so you can kind of see here how, those tactics of really coercing someone and keeping them and exploiting them for work happened. And so why does trafficking happen? I think there's a question that we hear often, and oftentimes we want to know why so we can prevent it. I think knowing that there are root causes is really important. And we know that human trafficking is fueled by poverty, oppression, unemployment, homelessness, limited access to resources. And people all over the world and, in the U.S. often find themselves living in poor socioeconomic conditions. And so they're drawn to opportunities, whether it's in their home country or in a more affluent country or area, and really in hopes of finding a better life. And so although human trafficking could, in theory, happen to anyone, we do see a trend that it's usually communities that are oppressed, underserved, and lack services and access to resources that are the most commonly impacted. So these include undocumented communities, the LGBTQ community, specifically the trans community, those who are in poverty and experiencing homelessness. And so, some of the policies that we have, within the U.S. or that other countries may have, for example, repressive immigration policies that prevent people to migrate freely and legally, seems to only increase the vulnerability. Traffickers also use, systems in place that continue to oppress these communities in order to control, right? And so something that we saw often where for those undocumented survivors, they were often threatened with deportation by the trafficker, and that person felt like they had no way of telling anyone what was going on because they were at fault, or they were told that they were at fault. And obviously, if they were to turn on the news, they would probably feel validated in that. And it has been our experience also that sometimes the law enforcement has arrested potential survivors, and so we know that there can be definitely great partnerships, but it's good to know and to keep in mind, some of these circumstances that continue to fuel human trafficking, and that the systems that are not meeting those needs. And so when we're thinking about, push and pull factors, through a rights-based lens, we really want to think about what makes people vulnerable to trafficking, what's pushing them and what's pulling them. So for example, you may have a U.S. citizen who identifies as gay, and they may not be supported, in their home, and may end up being kicked out or running away, and then they have unstable housing or no housing, and they're desperate to have access, to a safe place, or to food, or just to your basic resources. So a person may promise a home or work, or to take care of that individual in exchange for food and shelter. So remember that the exchange doesn't always have to be monetary. It doesn't have to be money. It can be of something of value to the survivor. Go ahead and move on to the next. So who's involved in human trafficking? I think there's a lot of stereotypes here, and oftentimes, I'm sure if you've worked with survivors of trafficking, family members may ask you about the movie Taken, and if that is what it's like. And of course, it is not, at least in my experience, it has not been that way. And so I know that there often is a stereotype that a trafficker is a stranger who kidnaps young girls to sell them. And it's a common misconception. So really, in reality, survivors often have a pre-existing relationship with that person. So it may be a family member, a friend, a peer, an employer, or like the case that I talked about, maybe even a community member, a well-respected community member. For the survivors, I think, again, we often hear of young girls and women, and in reality, it's men, women, gender nonconforming individuals, which we also need to keep in mind that as we continue to further these common stereotypes and myths, that also limits the resources from individuals who need them and from communities that aren't, being served. So again, men, potentially minors, other people that may not be what we think of when we think of survivors. And so I do want to cover just briefly male survivors. We know that obviously they can be trafficked for sex and for labor. Oftentimes, I think when I've worked with male survivors, there's been a stigma associated with gender norms. So when I've worked with survivors who have been trafficked for sex, it's very, for any individual, I think that can be very uncomfortable to discuss. But I have found in my personal practice that with male survivors, it's even more difficult. And I think as a good practice point, it's really important with any survivor to really allow them to share what they need to share and not force them to tell a story or their story. Also thinking about what information you need in order to provide the services. Oftentimes you don't need a full story, right? And they can choose what feels comfortable for them, and really acknowledging that there is a power dynamic between a service provider and a survivor. And we want to not just acknowledge that, but really try to remove that as much as possible. In addition, I think with male survivors, I've seen kind of a normalization of work conditions. And oftentimes, with people who are coming from other countries, it's that it's expected or that is common, if you're being exploited, or that's just kind of the conditions of the job. And so oftentimes they may not self-report or even feel like there's a problem because that's just the way it is, and they just want to get paid. And oftentimes they're trying to send money back to family members. That's been at least my experience. And so those are just some things to keep in mind when we're not seeing a lot of male survivors. It's not because they're not there. It's because oftentimes, there are other things that are preventing them from getting there. With foreign nationals, this can be inclusive of both undocumented individuals and those who have a visa or other legal entry. It's really important to remember that there are some visas that tie a person to one employer. And if that employer is trafficking you, and if you decide to leave that employer, all of a sudden you're out of status and now you could be deported. So again, these systems that continue to fuel and make people susceptible to human trafficking. Another thing, like I mentioned, are people being threatened by traffickers and in fear of deportation. Definitely threats to family in home countries, and I always take those seriously because even though we know threats are common, a lot, I've definitely had survivors where those threats have been carried out, and so we never want to assume, kind of what we think is the right thing for the survivor. We really want to take that survivor's lead. And so I'm going to go quickly through the next ones. I know that we have been spending some time kind of getting the foundation, but I think it's important to remember that and all of you will likely are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Traffickers always prey on vulnerabilities of individuals. And so a person who doesn't have their most basic needs met, like a place to stay, is going to be more susceptible, right? And so it's important to know that people may be susceptible, additionally, or more susceptible because they don't have those minimum needs met, but also once they exit the situation, they're going to have to meet those initial needs first. So once a survivor exits a trafficking situation, their most immediate need is food and shelter, most often shelter. And so if we want them to have, sometimes as service providers, we want them to have a life plan, and we want them to get a job and access education because those are our wishes for them. But we cannot even begin to have those conversations if they don't have a safe place to be and somewhere that is longer term. Where sometimes we're referring to shelters, but shelters have time limits. And so what happens at the end of 30, 60, or 90 days when that person is homeless again. And so it's really important to think about long permanent housing. In control and coercion, we know that there are a lot of tactics that traffickers use that continue to control survivors, and that there's going to be a lot of stigma and guilt that comes from that survivor, as you may be meeting with them. Why don't survivors leave? A lot of times, I think there are lots of reasons. They're complex, and they're going to be based on each individual. I think commonly we see a lot of
activity, and that doesn't need to be physical. A lot of times, a person is told that they're being watched all day, whether in reality they are or whether, they have that perception that they are. They have, language or isolation or social barriers that may prevent them from accessing help. Obviously, the use of threats or actual, violence and shame and self-blame, I think, are common. And so we hear oftentimes, how do I identify a victim? I think that there are a lot of reasons why identification can be difficult. And so it's important to, be knowledgeable of those. Here I'm sharing some possible indicators of, what it can look like. I want to give the caveat that even if a person needs many of these, it does not automatically make them a survivor of trafficking. And so we really want to make sure that we're doing, our due diligence and that we're connecting with service providers on the ground so that way they can provide that support in being able to serve a survivor of trafficking. I added some questions to keep in mind as far as, how you can have these conversations if you are going to be working with a survivor of trafficking. I think it's important to also know why you're asking the question. So if you suspect that somebody's a survivor of trafficking, it's also important to have an idea in mind as far as what are some support systems in place that can serve them. You'll have these available on your slides, but I want to just quickly touch on it's really important to have choice and access for survivors. So they need to have the choice of when they leave, where they live, if they want to report to law enforcement or if they don't, if they want to engage in services, and if they want to receive mental health counseling. By having both that choice and access, it's going to allow them to have a reduced risk of re-exploitation, not be re-traumatized, and have a better quality of life. And we never want to mirror the trafficking situation that they just came out of. And we often can by asserting, power and control over them. So we never want to do that. Services that individuals need or that survivors need are going to be, anything that you would need if you were, exiting a situation where you're not familiar or you don't have resources. So really connecting and taking a holistic approach is going to be really important in order to meeting those needs. In trauma-informed services, I think it's really important to put the focus on the survivor, on what they want, what their needs are, and their preferences. So it's always important to have survivor choice, again, reporting to law enforcement or not, and choosing what activities or services they partake in, and also not excluding them or screening them out from your services because they don't want to go to detox, because they don't want to go to counseling, because they don't want to go to job training. Their reasons are valid, and although we have wishes for them that we hope they will take, it is really important that we allow them to and for us to be centered around what their needs are. And here are just some quick references of some of the things I was talking about, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jess.
Thank you so much, Karen. So how can providers implement trauma-informed services? Karen did a great job of defining trauma-informed care for us. So these next slides seek to elaborate on these concepts just a little bit further. Here we are. So how can providers implement these services? When we're talking about the level of engagement, let's talk first about safety. When we think about safety, are we considering safety within that person-centered approach, right? Are we considering safety within the community? Is there, cultural safety? Is there racial safety? Are we considering safety within the context of the neighborhood when we're talking about housing services, specifically, or just in general, is that neighborhood safe for the survivor? And more importantly, are we considering safety within the context of that service relationship? The next point is about trustworthiness, and I think that just adds to what I'm talking about. I had a friend who would always say, like, trustworthiness is spelled trust is spelled T-I-M-E, time. So sometimes it is a very long, rough road before this can fully be achieved because trust is proven over time? How are we continuing to show up? And are we modeling corrective experiences? Because you shouldn't trust people you just met, right? Like that's some of the, for a lot of survivors, that's some of those lack of boundaries, could lead to further exploitation or further, risky situations. So how are we modeling that? Karen's mentioned this a bunch of times, choice and collaboration. Can't stress the importance. We all want a say in the decisions that affect our lives, every single one of us. So are we thinking about that and empowerment in every facet, right? In the program settings, in the physical settings, as I said, in the service relationship, and are we creating that balance of doing things with survivors instead of for them? And I know there are certain things that we need to do for them, but in general, are we giving folks the tools and the support and the resources they need so that they can do these things for themselves? Because that's ultimately what we need, to be successful in our lives. So from the level of approach, what does trauma-informed mean? It means elevating that connection between that history of trauma that person has and their symptoms and their behaviors, right? And I think the biggest takeaway is also doing no additional harm. We want to make sure that a person is seeking help and support, that is exactly what we're meeting them with, and not further, harm. Survivors are often, live in a world where someone is there to take from you. There is no one, and so we can create that corrective experience by creating that sense of safety and that and doing no additional harm, within that service relationship. So another important thing is to break goals down into manageable steps. Are we setting folks up for success? Oftentimes when you start something new, you pretty much think you're not going to be able to do it. And if we start with, something that is sort of out of reach, it's going to be difficult to build up that sense of being able to achieve something or being able to get, out of something if we're not thinking about how we are setting folks up for success. So that leads me to empathy. Sorry about that. That leads me to empathy. So an empathetic approach. Are we aware of how our questions, our body language, our tone can create judgment or shame? And another really important thing is staying open to feedback. Are we, divesting personally from shame? Staying open to growth and learning? Are we accepting that we can't possibly know everything and be perfect all the time? And that's okay, and that we can be accountable to that. Are we sort of figuring out and questioning how systems of power and control will be our life's work to undo and repair? So I think Karen mentioned not, wanting to make sure that we are not sort of mimicking the abusive power and control dynamic that existed within the context of the trafficking situation. Another important piece is, are we staying attuned to our unconscious bias? Are we further examining, any anti-Blackness, any fat phobia, any ableism, any transphobia or trans antagonism, classism or internalized racism or supremacy? Are we rejecting the binaries of deserving and undeserving because we are there to serve everyone? Are we rolling with the resistance? Because again, change is hard. I know that each and every one of us can, attest to wanting to change something about ourselves and not being successful in the first attempt. So are we holding space for that? And are we empowering folks to see their worthiness? I'm a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation in childhood, and I had been abused for such a long time, since I was 2 years old, that I did not have any self-worth. I didn't understand that it was so normalized and ingrained as to a part of just what you're expected to do, a part of what of the everyday. And so you couldn't convince me or tell me that I was worthy because I was certain that I was put on earth to be abused. So are we challenging those belief systems, right? And how are we challenging them? Because just telling me, no, you are, was not helpful, right? So how are we showing folks, how are we proving to folks, how are we creating experiences or understanding for people so that they can really see and step into their own worthiness. Other pieces that are important, and I think honestly most important for service providers, are we staying attuned to our own personal needs? Oftentimes when we take things personally, I mean, we're all human beings, so it's hard to not take things personally. But again, this is a client, it's a person, but it's also a situation that exists within this service relationship, right? So how are we not taking things personally? And I think that the only way to do that is to advocate for supportive supervision, to have a safe space to process feelings, compassion fatigue, burnout. Are we being given the option to deal with these things so we can respond thoughtfully and compassionately and not be, super activated by something someone says to us? Because these folks are seeking compassion, these survivors are seeking compassion and understanding, and we cannot offer that unless we are taking care of ourselves, essentially, unless we are offering it to ourselves first. So all important notes. So again, when we talk about client-centered care, often called survivor-centered or victim-centered or empowerment-centered, which all refer to the same thing. And I guess I heard Karen use the term person-centered earlier, and I just thought that was so fantastic because it captures all of those things, all those titles or labels into one very concrete, concept. This is a person. So are we honoring that person's right to self-determination, that person's agency, and are we co-constructing plans based on the discussions and based on informed compromise, right? Because oftentimes we just have this prescriptive analysis or prescriptive measure of what this person needs because that's all we're able to offer them, right? These are our barriers or our prescription for these things. But are we doing the work to advocate for a different sort of thing because not everyone needs the same thing? And specifically, how are we reducing risk? And I will touch on why this is important later in the next few slides. But this approach is important because it doesn't require abstinence from the behavior or abstinence from the situation for support. And the reason this is important is because it normalizes why a person is benefiting from the behavior and how it's serving them. People don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to ruin my life today. That's not the thought process, And oftentimes that's the approach that we're taking, like, why are you doing this? There's obviously an unmet need that is being met. There are, and this approach makes space to look at that. It makes space to look at that issue and think critically about it. And it removes that shame and it removes that stigma associated with the behavior, so you can think about it. Furthermore, it's sort of an empowered, centered way to engage with folks because our role is that of a support. We're not running in there like a savior because we can't save anybody. People have to save themselves. So the role is that of the support, and so we're not really responsible for what that person is doing. More so, we're engaging in dialogue and demonstrating the willingness to explore, what risks are present, and helping that person determine for themselves the benefits and risks of anything, and managing that risk. And sometimes that can help, minimize the harm that may come from the risky behavior. And sometimes it feels like a willingness to tolerate the behavior, but what we have to recognize is that person ultimately has free will and that only them can decide what's best for them. And so that's what we're trying to do is help, formulate more healthy behavior. So, I don't know why that keeps happening. I'm so sorry. Here we go. Our next slide is about allies. We hear often, I'm an ally to this community. So let's talk about what that really means. I like that little circle because it says, it pretty much captures, you know, the gist of this, which is that ally is a verb and not a noun. So being a good ally means constantly working alongside the communities that you're allying yourself to, which can sometimes mean stepping up, but can often mean stepping back. So these are some tips here on how to be a good ally. The first one being acknowledging our privilege. Some examples of that may be, you know, just examining what our definition of success is, and how we're projecting that definition on our client, on the survivor. Oftentimes, I don't know if anyone's ever suffered from depression. You know, getting out of bed and brushing your teeth is a massive win. So if we're hoping that folks, you know, will jump into the program and go right into the services and excel at everything, and you know, go do this, that, and the other for themselves. And that is a very unrealistic expectation, you know? So what we need to sort of focus on instead is how that survivor is what's the definition of success is for that survivor. Another piece, and you know, that just makes me think of, you know, when a person loses their ability to walk, we don't say to that person, it's clear that you don't want to walk anymore, right? We take them to physical therapy. We move one limb at a time until that person relearns how to live a new normal, understanding, like, muscle by muscle, and understanding that that new normal may look and feel different. And that's important to remember, that as far as investigating our privilege is concerned, because you know, we have no idea what that human being is dealing with. So listening is massive as well, as a very important concept. Instead of assuming, we must listen. You know, impacted people know what is best. Basically, they know, like, the best way to meet their needs and what their unmet needs are. So are we listening more than we are talking? So the next point is about learning and unlearning. Are we committed to that? I think we're all guilty of stereotyping someone at some point in our lives. So I think it's important to learn from one another and to start to deconstruct these biases and learn truth. And the only way we can do that is by centering those people, those impacted people. And are we doing that work of initiating tough conversations, you know, with our colleagues around this work, and continuing to educate those around us now that we have, you know, new information. And of course, getting involved, you know, politically within your organizations, within your families, and supporting survivors at every stage of their recovery, at every stage of their lives, not just when they're doing good or what we want them to do, or not just, you know, when they're in crisis, because this is a lifelong journey of recovery. So are we present? How can we be present in those ways? Are we sharing resources? Are we sponsoring this uplift? So the next slides are basically touching on the intersections of housing, homelessness, and human trafficking. In a 2018 research study brought to us by Polaris called On-Ramps, Intersections, and Exit Routes, 127 survivors were surveyed, and 64% of the respondents reported being homeless or experiencing unstable housing when they were recruited. So, which means that for many survivors, experiencing homelessness or housing instability was a huge vulnerability and a potential on-ramp or push-pull factor, as Karen was stating earlier. And similarly, from January 2015 to December 2017, the National Human Trafficking Hotline learned of 1,548 potential victims experiencing unstable housing at the start of that trafficking situation. And I think that the takeaway is that we need to keep in mind that these are numbers. These numbers are from survivors who knew or suspected that they were being trafficked, and who were aware of the hotline as a resource. So again, that is another thing of note, is that most folks who are being trafficked often don't realize or understand that they are being trafficked. You know, folks don't order. Some folks have come to us, you know, in different capacities and said, like, I understand this definition. I think that I meet the, you know, the legal definition of the situation. But oftentimes, like Karen said before, we have to do our due diligence of really putting two and two together as far as indicators are concerned. And another thing as far as housing is concerned is that the National Survivor Network, which I'm a coordinator of, hosted a call last year with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they expressed that the barriers to housing were across the housing spectrum. So stakeholders across the housing systems all had a role to play in preventing and responding to trafficking, because oftentimes, you know, even landlords and property managers or rental companies would not rent to survivors for various reasons, like criminal records, no credit, bad credit, lack of employment history. Because their knowledge of their survivor status, they would not let them break a lease in an emergency. In the case of public housing, folks could not or couldn't in a timely manner, you know, be rehoused, even in crisis level situations. Housing providers oftentimes deemed human trafficking survivors like too high risk or too high maintenance to take on, especially because there's like a huge lack of trafficking specific shelters. For labor trafficking survivors, as Karen mentioned, men and trans folks, the shelters for those populations were limited or non-existent, and many organizations or agencies just, you know, limited their definition of violence, of interpersonal violence. Therefore, they weren't willing or able to house or serve human trafficking survivors. So some of the solutions that folks came up with were just like adapting the definition or policies to include everyone, because, as I believe Karen mentioned, it's very likely that we are already serving human trafficking survivors in our systems. So if we can just expand that cultural sensitivity and that understanding to further integrate survivors of human trafficking, then we would be able to provide comprehensive services that, you know, and use those best practices, because especially for survivors who are left out of that typical human trafficking narrative, this was really, really, really important. And another piece that was huge was not rejecting survivors with substance abuse disorder, because we all know that substance abuse or numbing is integrated with and sometimes heavily managed by the trafficker. So instead of considering partnering, so instead of rejecting folks for not, for still, you know, being on substances, considering partnering with local substance abuse disorder treatment programs or things like that, so that more folks had accessibility to housing and supportive services. Again, and not, you know, mirroring those power dynamics that folks were subjected to by saying, no, you know, you cannot have services here. So let's touch a little bit on the experiences that often set the groundwork for trafficking, what some folks call the grooming process, although I should also mention that, you know, trafficking can and does occur outside of these factors as well. But these stair steps, ACEs, abuse continuums, exploitation, and trafficking are all interrelated. Oftentimes people are like, how could someone let this, et cetera, and these are some of the some of the things that we hear from clients about why why this sort of these experiences that existed prior to the trafficking situation, laid that groundwork, set the scene essentially for the trafficking. So when we talk about ACEs, I'm sure you've all heard of this before. We're talking about traumatic events experienced before the age of 18. So some of those things are abuse, neglect, parental mental illness, incarceration, domestic violence, etc. An abuse continuum illustrates how abuse can become normalized, thereby becoming more severe and more frequent. And most often the individual does not realize that what they're experiencing is abuse, exploitation, or trafficking. Sometimes even conflating the abusive situation with rescue because trauma alters your perception of the world. So this makes me think about my own experiences. I was abused throughout my childhood. I came into a living situation where I was being abused by being raped by my cousin every single day, and I just thought, I'd rather be, having sex with a stranger than have to have my cousin abuse me every single day, because it felt better, quote unquote, the lesser of the evils, to be forced to have sex with someone I didn't know than someone who is supposed to take care of me and not do this to me. So again, to completely one abuse sort of completely normalizing another abuse and feeling as if this was the better situation, feeling as if that was the rescue. So exploitation is to take unfair advantage and or use for work or other activities for the benefit of others, monetarily, socially, et cetera, to the detriment of that being a form of coercion and violence. So oftentimes people are being, work exploited, and they think, this is an opportunity to get out of this exploitive situation. I'm going to take this opportunity, and it can often be a trafficking situation. So these are, I'm just going to read these quickly. These next slides are some case studies, and the underlying things are, again, the pieces that are underlined are speak to these last 1, 2, 3 bullet points on stair steps. Felipe lived in a small fishing village in the Philippines. He started selling fish with his family when he was 4 years old. He came from a family of 8 and was constantly being pressured by his family to help alleviate the poverty they lived in. He cared for his sick aunt so he would have housing and sold vegetables in the town square. Felipe borrowed money and participated in a few professional development courses. After the courses, Felipe was having difficulty managing his responsibilities and securing work. On top of owing money, his creditors explained that there was a way for Felipe to obtain work in the United States, but that he would have to petition a sports visa and go through Taekwondo courses in case questions were asked. He completed the courses, accruing more debt. Furthermore, the employment agents stated the company would graciously support his documentation, travel, work, and living arrangements, deducting these costs from his pay of $150 a week. Felipe had only ever dreamt of a salary that high. Once he arrived in the United States, he was transported to a nursing home facility. His employer asked to hold his passport in case he thought about running away without paying his debt. And then mentioned involving law and immigration enforcement because of what he had agreed to do if he didn't agree to their terms. His employer informed him that the debt he had accrued on top of his living expenses required him to work for an elder care facility for 10 years without pay. Felipe is beaten by his employers, and when he attempts to speak to a neighbor one day, he started to accept this circumstances as his fate. He became severely depressed. He also begins sneaking some of the client's medication and stealing money to buy alcohol. When he picks up their groceries, Felipe is intoxicated one night and attempts to end his life and is brought to the emergency room. So these are all based on real life survivors, and I think we can see here where the adverse childhood experiences, where the experiences of abuse continuums and the experience of exploitation on top of the intersections of homelessness, substance abuse, and mental illness all start to play, and we're dealing with folks who have compounding situations happening at once. This is another quick one, which, let's see, do we have enough time for this? I believe we do. Sarah is a transgender youth who was kicked out of her home by transphobic parents. She has been using heroin to numb the pain of rejection and the daily remarks and the physical assault she is experiencing on the street. She is accepted into a shelter program and agreed to visit the wellness center. Sarah met with a psychiatrist who diagnosed her with bipolar disorder, PTSD, and psychosis, and prescribed Sarah medication. Her transgender care specialist also helped Sarah get off hormones she was buying from her friend and connected her to an endocrinologist. After weeks at the shelter, Sarah was sexually assaulted by another shelter resident. She left the shelter and began stealing to survive. Sarah is arrested and befriends someone in jail who tells her that they can offer her protection and a place to sleep when she gets out. Sarah takes them up on their offer, and after 2 weeks, they ask Sarah if she would be their girlfriend. They mention the feelings of love that are developing. However, since rescuing her, they have been dreaming about how much better life was going to be now that they found each other. And after 3 weeks, they start to become upset with how Sarah should really be contributing to the rent and their lifestyle. The next day, Sarah is ordered to work on the streets, casinos, and internet. So these are sort of some stories that help us sort of deconstruct how, why this is happening to folks. So again, these are, in addition to the things that Karen mentioned, these are things that are needed: training for folks, creating LGBT inclusive spaces, changing organizational culture, collaborating, because as you can see there, we have different stressors here in the slides that we just looked over. So, substance abuse treatment, social services, legal counseling, all those things are things that we can collaborate with other organizations on, making sure we're accommodating all human trafficking survivors. And lastly, like beyond a broad spectrum of services, there are other things that are sort of as housing providers. I believe that's most of the folks on the call are housing providers that are beyond our capacities, but are things that we should be thinking about. Things like broad spectrum of services, mental health, human, and are we making sure that our organization is taking human rights, public health framework approaches? Are we thinking about how to support, long-term housing, living wages, empowering survivor-led solutions, all things that really sustain this work long-term. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you. Thank you both, Karen and Jess. You did a great job. So we've only got about, 4 minutes left. So I guess we are not going to have lots of time for questions, but there were a couple, couple things that you noted, Jess, in particular, that, homelessness is not uncommon among the folks who have experienced trafficking, as well as serious mental illness and substance use disorders. I guess what I would ask each of you is, what is one thing? You've been in this work a long time. You understand what's happening with this very painful and difficult issue. So I guess I would just ask each of you to tell the audience what is one thing you wish you could tell your younger self that you that would help you move forward in this very difficult and emotional work.
A co-moderator has joined the conference.
Hi,
Karen, would you
Karen.
like to go first? Sure.
Sure, yeah. So I think one thing that I would tell myself is, I think starting off trying to serve survivors, any type of survivor, there's always our best wishes and intentions that we have. I think it's important to remember that although we have great intentions, we cannot let those supersede what the survivor needs. And also we need to acknowledge our impact. And so whatever type of service that we are providing, if we are doing it in a way that minimizes or takes away their choice, it is no longer useful, right? And so I think I would tell myself to really allow the survivor to lead, and also to really explore, what it means to be a service provider and not a savior, because a lot of times we want to get into this line of work because we want to help, and we need to understand what is actually helpful for survivors.
That is a great tip. And I think that's something we've often said in this space is it's deeply important to let the client drive the bus. I mean, we all can project our hopes and wishes for somebody, but if they don't own them, it doesn't help. So thank you for that. Jess, what would you like to tell your younger self?
I think I would say, and this is just like a quick off the cuff, I just think I would remind myself that all human beings are born good and worthy. I can see, like, another piece that's important to talk about, as far as trauma is concerned, is that trauma really distorts your perception, and sort of the trauma's effect on your self-esteem is that and your self-worth is that it essentially robs you of those things. So I think I would remind myself that, like I can often see the good in other people, and I can often see the worthiness in other people, but I have a hard time, especially in my youth, I had a very hard time understanding that that I too was good and that I too was worthy. And so I would have held on to that, concept or that thought or that belief. And I think that it would, have sort of changed the impact of certain things. And so, I definitely feel that I'm there now. And so I grant myself the grace of not knowing or having, knowing that, like, again, when we talk about being trauma informed, like, I didn't do anything, something happened to me. And so just removing the shame and blame and stigma and placing it where it belongs and removing it from myself and knowing that I am good and I am worthy.
Oh, that is wonderful, and a wonderful place to stop. There was one thing that one of you said, and I apologize because I don't remember which said it, but it was really good language that I think that it's important for us to remember. We never say to a person who can't walk, oh, it appears that you don't want to walk anymore. And I think that is a really useful tip to remember, right? That was excellent, so I loved it. This is fabulous, and I thank you both so much for helping us with this and for sharing your knowledge and your stories. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Zach, who will close us out. So thanks, everyone. Take care.